Black teacher disappeared on her way to school in 1979. 35 years later, her wedding ring was found. The fog rolled thick through Millbrook, Georgia that Monday morning in October 1979, wrapping around the old oak trees like ghostly fingers. Eleanor Davis stood at her kitchen window, watching the mist dance across her small front yard. At 28, she had the kind of gentle strength that drew children to her like moths to a warm flame. Her dark eyes sparkled with the same curiosity she tried to spark in her third-grade students every single day. Another foggy morning, she murmured to herself, adjusting the collar of her favorite burgundy dress, the one her husband James had bought her for their second wedding anniversary. The simple gold band on her finger caught the dim morning light as she reached for her coffee cup. Eleanor never left home without that ring. It was her anchor, her reminder of love in a world that often felt hostile. She was one of only 3 black teachers at Pine Grove Elementary, and the only one who dared to speak up when things weren't right. The previous week, she noticed that the black children were being given the oldest, most worn textbooks while the white children received the new editions. When she mentioned it during the staff meeting, the room had fallen silent. Principal Morrison had cleared his throat uncomfortably and mumbled something about budget constraints. But Eleanor Davis wasn't the type to stay quiet about injustice. "Morning, baby," James called from the hallway, straightening his tie. He worked at the local post office and took pride in his uniform, pressing it meticulously every Sunday night. "You sure you don't want me to drive you today? This fog's thicker than molasses." Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that could light up even the gloomiest Georgia morning. "I'll be fine, honey. Besides, I like the walk. Gives me time to think about my lesson plans." She kissed his cheek, tasting the lingering hint of his aftershave. "Mrs. Henderson's daughter is struggling with her reading, and I want to try something new with her today." That was Eleanor, always thinking about her students first. She gathered her worn leather satchel, stuffed full of graded papers and a fresh batch of homemade cookies for the children who sometimes came to school without breakfast. The bag was heavy, but Eleanor carried it like it held treasures instead of just another teacher's daily load. "What time will you be home?" James asked, following her to the front door. "Same as always, around 4:30. I'm staying a bit late to help Tommy Washington with his math. That boy's got potential, but nobody's taking the time to see it." Eleanor's voice carried that familiar note of determination that James had fallen in love with. She never just taught children, she believed in them. The morning air was crisp and damp as Eleanor stepped onto their small front porch. The fog was so thick she could barely see the Johnsons' house next door. But she'd walked this route to Pine Grove Elementary hundreds of times. She could find her way blindfolded. "Be careful, Ellie," James called after her, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Always am," she called back, her voice already fading into the mist. Eleanor walked down Maple Street, her low heels clicking against the damp pavement. The fog muffled all sounds, creating an eerie quiet that made her footsteps seem unnaturally loud. She hummed softly to herself, a gospel tune her grandmother used to sing, as she navigated the familiar path. At Pine Grove Elementary, the morning routine was as predictable as sunrise. Teachers arrived by 7:45, students by 8:15, and the first bell rang at 8:30 sharp. Eleanor's classroom was always one of the first to fill with the sounds of children's laughter and eager chatter. But on that foggy Monday morning, room 12 remained silent. By 8 a.m., Mrs. Patricia Coleman, the second-grade teacher next door, noticed Eleanor's classroom lights were still off. "That's odd," she murmured to herself. Eleanor was never late. In fact, she was usually the first teacher in the building, often arriving before the janitor had even unlocked the doors. "Has anyone seen Mrs. Davis this morning?" Mrs. Coleman asked during the brief teachers' gathering before first bell. Principal Morrison glanced at his watch. "I'm sure she'll be along. Traffic's probably slow with this fog." But Eleanor didn't drive to school. Everyone knew she walked. By 8:30, Eleanor's 22 third-graders were lined up outside her locked classroom door, their small faces pressed against the window, looking for their beloved teacher. Little Susie Martinez tugged on Mrs. Coleman's skirt. "Where's Mrs. Davis? She promised to read us the next chapter of Charlotte's Web today." By 9:15, Principal Morrison was pacing his office, repeatedly dialing Eleanor's home phone. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. James had already left for work, and Eleanor should have been at school an hour ago. "Something's not right," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, as she watched the principal's growing agitation. "Mrs. Davis has never missed a day without calling. Not once in 3 years." At 10:30 a.m., Principal Morrison made the call that would change everything. "Sheriff's Department? We need someone to check on one of our teachers. Eleanor Davis. She never came to school this morning, and that's just not like her." Sheriff Bob Crawley knew Eleanor by reputation, the young black teacher who'd been making waves, asking questions that made some folks uncomfortable. He assigned Deputy Martinez to drive Eleanor's usual route from her house to the school. The fog had lifted by noon, revealing a crisp October day painted in brilliant oranges and golds. Deputy Martinez drove slowly down Maple Street, then turned onto Pine Grove Road, scanning the ditches and wooded areas along the way. It was 12:45 p.m. when he spotted it. Eleanor's brown leather purse lay in the tall grass beside Pine Grove Road, about halfway between her house and the school. The bag was open, its contents scattered: a small address book, a pack of tissues, a few coins, and a photograph of Eleanor and James on their wedding day. But Eleanor's wallet was missing. And so was Eleanor. Deputy Martinez radioed for backup, his voice tight with concern. "Sheriff, I found her purse. But there's no sign of Mrs. Davis anywhere." By evening, half the town was searching. James walked the roads calling Eleanor's name until his voice was hoarse, refusing to believe that his wife had simply vanished into thin air. Neighbors joined the search, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness like desperate stars. But Eleanor Davis was gone. That night, as James sat alone in their small kitchen, still wearing the clothes he'd put on 16 hours earlier, the whispers began. They started quietly, in hushed conversations on front porches and in grocery store aisles. Some said Eleanor had been getting too bold, too outspoken about the treatment of black students. Others wondered if she'd discovered something she shouldn't have, something that certain people wanted to keep buried. She was asking too many questions. Someone whispered at the diner. Making too much noise about things better left alone. Another voice added. But those who knew Eleanor best, her students, her fellow teachers, her husband, they knew better. Eleanor Davis wasn't the type to run away from problems. She was the type to face them head-on, no matter the cost. As the fog rolled in again that Tuesday morning, Eleanor's empty classroom stood as a silent testament to a woman who had simply wanted to make the world a little better, one child at a time. The question that haunted everyone was simple yet terrifying. What had happened to Eleanor Davis? And why did it feel like some people in town weren't as surprised by her disappearance as they should have been? The answers would remain buried for 35 long years, waiting like seeds in dark soil for the right moment to finally break through into the light. Time has a cruel way of erasing even the most important people from memory. By 1985, Eleanor Davis had become little more than a whispered name in Millbrook, Georgia. The search efforts that had consumed the town for months after her disappearance gradually faded into occasional conversations at church socials and barbershop discussions that always ended with the same helpless shrug. "Whatever happened to that teacher?" someone might ask, and the response was always the same uncomfortable silence. James Davis aged 10 years in the first 2 after Eleanor vanished. His once proud posture curved inward, as if he were carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier each day. He kept Eleanor's coffee cup on the kitchen counter, still set out every morning as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Her burgundy dress remained hanging in their closet, untouched, still holding the faint scent of her perfume. "You need to move on, son," his pastor, Reverend Williams, would say gently during their weekly visits. "Eleanor wouldn't want you living like this." But James couldn't move on. How do you move on when half of your heart has simply disappeared? The official investigation had stalled within 6 months. Sheriff Crawley, who'd seemed so determined initially, gradually stopped returning James's calls. The case files gathered dust in a back cabinet, marked as unsolved, but effectively forgotten. New crimes demanded attention. Life moved forward, even when some people were left behind. The 1990s brought changes to Millbrook that seemed designed to erase Eleanor's memory entirely. Pine Grove Elementary was torn down in 1994, replaced by a modern brick building with central air conditioning and computer labs. The new principal, a young white woman from Atlanta, had never heard of Eleanor Davis. When James mentioned his wife during the dedication ceremony, the principal's polite but blank expression told him everything he needed to know. Eleanor was becoming a ghost story, and not even an interesting one. The new school was renamed Millbrook Elementary, and with that change came a subtle but deliberate forgetting. The few teachers who had worked with Eleanor were either retired or transferred. The children who had loved her were now adults with their own families, their memories of their favorite third-grade teacher fading like old photographs. But not everyone forgot. Miss Sarah Campbell had been 8 years old when Mrs. Davis disappeared. She remembered sitting in that hallway outside room 12, waiting for a teacher who never came. More importantly, she remembered the way Mrs. Davis had made her feel, seen, valued, important. Sarah had struggled with reading, and while other teachers had labeled her slow, Mrs. Davis had stayed after school, patiently working with her until the words finally made sense. "You're not slow, honey," Mrs. Davis had told her. "You just learn differently, and that makes you special." By 2010, Sarah Campbell had become a teacher herself, drawn to the profession by memories of the woman who had believed in her when no one else would. She taught 4th grade at the new Millbrook Elementary, and every year, she told her students about Mrs. Eleanor Davis, the teacher who had disappeared but had never stopped teaching. "Why don't we have anything to remember her by?" Sarah asked during a faculty meeting in 2012. "She was part of this school's history." The current principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was sympathetic but practical. "That was so long ago, Sarah. Do we even know what really happened to her?" That question haunted Sarah. She began researching Eleanor's disappearance, spending evenings at the library reading old newspaper clippings on microfilm. The articles from 1979 painted a picture of a thorough investigation, but Sarah noticed something troubling. The coverage stopped abruptly after just 3 months, as if someone had decided the story was no longer worth telling. James Davis had never remarried. By 2010, he was a fragile man of 71, still living in the same small house he'd shared with Eleanor. His hair had gone white, and his hands shook when he poured his morning coffee, still using Eleanor's cup, though he could never explain why to the few visitors he allowed. Sarah Campbell found him there on a cold February morning in 2013, after tracking down his address through old school records. She knocked hesitantly on his door, unsure of her welcome. "Mr. Davis? My name is Sarah Campbell. I was one of your wife's students." James's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, studied her face. "Sarah, little Sarah who had trouble with reading?" "Yes, sir. She helped me. She changed my life." For the first time in years, James Davis smiled, really smiled. "Come in, child. Come in and tell me about Eleanor." They talked for hours. James showed Sarah photo albums he hadn't opened in decades, shared stories about Eleanor's dreams and fears, her love for her students, her growing concern about the unfair treatment she'd witnessed at school. "She was planning something," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The week before she disappeared, she was writing a lot. Staying up late making phone calls. She said she couldn't stay quiet anymore about what was happening to the children." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of things, Mr. Davis?" "I don't know exactly. She was protecting me, I think. But she was scared, Sarah. My Eleanor was scared, and that wasn't like her at all." That conversation changed everything for Sarah Campbell. She left James's house with a determination she'd never felt before. Eleanor Davis deserved better than to be forgotten. She deserved justice, or at least remembrance. Sarah proposed a memorial tree to the school board, a simple oak tree planted in Eleanor's honor, with a small plaque acknowledging her service. It took 2 years of persistent requests, but finally, in the spring of 2014, the board approved the project. "It's a lovely gesture," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Though I'm not sure how many people will remember who she was." Sarah smiled, thinking of James Davis sitting alone in his house, still setting out Eleanor's coffee cup every morning. "Someone will remember. Someone always remembers." The tree planting was scheduled for a warm May morning, 35 years after Eleanor Davis had walked into the fog and never returned. Sarah had no idea that this simple act of remembrance would finally bring Eleanor home. May 15, 2014 dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring morning that made everyone in Millbrook feel hopeful about new beginnings. Sarah Campbell arrived at the school early, carrying a small cooler filled with lemonade and homemade cookies, the same kind of thoughtful gesture Mrs. Davis might have made all those years ago. The memorial tree, a young oak sapling with sturdy branches and fresh green leaves, sat waiting in its burlap wrapping near the edge of the schoolyard. The bronze plaque beside it read simply, "In memory of Eleanor Davis, beloved teacher, 1951 to 1979. She believed every child could learn." James Davis had insisted on attending, despite his fragile health. Sarah had picked him up that morning, helping him from her car with gentle patience. At 73, he moved slowly, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "She would have loved this," he whispered, touching the smooth bark of the young tree. "Eleanor always said trees were like children, they just needed the right care to grow strong." By 10 a.m., a small crowd had gathered. There were current teachers, a few long-time residents who remembered Eleanor, and surprisingly, several middle-aged adults who had been her students. Word had somehow spread through the community's invisible network of shared memories. "Mrs. Davis was the first teacher who ever told me I was smart," said Marcus Thompson, now a successful accountant in Atlanta who had driven down specifically for the ceremony. "I never forgot that." Mrs. Rodriguez gave a brief speech about honoring the past while building the future, and then it was time to plant the tree. The spot they'd chosen was perfect, near the playground where Eleanor's students had once played, but far enough from the building to give the oak room to grow. Sarah had recruited her current 4th grade class to help with the actual planting, believing that children should be part of honoring a teacher who had loved children so much. 22 eager 9-year-olds, almost the same number Eleanor had taught, surrounded the planting site with barely contained excitement. "Okay, everyone," Sarah called out. "We need to dig a hole big enough for our tree's roots. Remember, we're not just planting a tree, we're creating something that will be here long after we're gone." Little Maria Gonzalez, who reminded Sarah so much of herself at that age, raised her hand. "Miss Campbell, can we dig with our hands? My abuela says plants grow better when you touch the soil with your own hands." "That's a beautiful idea, Maria. Let's all help." The children dropped to their knees around the designated spot, their small hands eagerly scooping soil. The earth was soft and rich, perfect for planting, but as they dug deeper, their enthusiasm was interrupted by an unexpected discovery. "Miss Campbell," called out Tommy Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson. "There's something hard here." Sarah knelt beside him, brushing dirt away from what appeared to be a metal corner. "Hold on, everyone. Let's be careful." As more soil was cleared away, the outline of a rectangular metal box became visible. It was old, very old, with rust covering most of its surface and dents that spoke of years buried underground. The box was about the size of a shoebox, sealed tightly against time and weather. A hush fell over the crowd. James Davis, supported by his cane, made his way closer to the excavation site. When he saw the box, his face went pale. "Oh my lord," he whispered. "Oh my sweet lord." Sarah looked up at him, concerned. "Mr. Davis? Are you all right?" "That box," James said, his voice shaking. "I've seen it before. Eleanor had one just like it. She kept important papers in it, said metal boxes lasted longer than anything else." The crowd pressed closer, but Sarah held up her hand. Everyone please step back. We need to call the police. Why? Asked one of the parents. It's probably just some old junk someone buried years ago. But Sarah had a feeling, the kind of gut instinct that teachers develop about when something important is happening. Because, she said quietly, this might not be junk at all. Principal Rodriguez made the call while Sarah and the children moved away from the dig site. Within 30 minutes, Deputy Sheriff Martinez, son of the deputy who had found Eleanor's purse 35 years earlier, arrived with 2 other officers. You think this might be connected to the old Davis case? He asked Sarah quietly. I don't know, Sarah replied. But the timing, finding this here, today, when we're planting a tree for Eleanor, it feels like more than coincidence. The officers carefully excavated the box, photographing its position and the surrounding soil. When they finally lifted it free, everyone could see that despite the rust and damage, the box had remained sealed. Whatever was inside had been protected from decades of Georgia weather. We'll need to open this at the station, Deputy Martinez announced. If this is evidence in an old case, we have to follow proper procedure. Wait, James Davis called out, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. If that box belonged to my Eleanor, I have a right to be there when you open it. Deputy Martinez looked uncertain. Sir, I understand, but that woman was my wife, James said firmly. For 35 years, I've wondered what happened to her. If there's any chance that box has answers, I'm going to be there to hear them. Sarah stepped forward. I'd like to be there too, if that's possible. Eleanor was my teacher, and I'm the one who organized this ceremony. Whatever's in that box was meant to be found. 2 hours later, at the sheriff's station, a small group gathered around a metal table where the rusted box sat under bright fluorescent lights. James Davis, Sarah Campbell, Deputy Martinez, and Sheriff Patricia Crawley, Bob Crawley's daughter, who had taken over the department 5 years earlier. Sheriff Crawley photographed the box from every angle before carefully prying open the corroded lid. It opened with a metallic screech that sounded like a voice crying out after decades of silence. Inside, wrapped in what had once been plastic bags, were several items that made everyone in the room hold their breath. A simple gold wedding band, tarnished but unmistakable. A stack of moldy lesson plans, written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. And at the bottom, sealed in a smaller metal container that had kept it almost perfectly preserved, several pages of Eleanor's journal. James Davis began to cry, not the quiet tears of an old man, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose heart was finally breaking after 35 years of being frozen in hope. Sarah picked up the first journal page with trembling hands and read the words that would change everything. If I vanish before the meeting with the board, it's not by choice. Protect the children. Tell someone. The silence in the sheriff's station was deafening. Sheriff Crawley leaned forward, her professional composure cracking as she studied the journal pages spread across the metal table. The handwriting was faded but legible, each word preserved like evidence waiting 35 years to speak. There's more, Sarah whispered, carefully turning to the next page. Her voice was barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the words disappear. James Davis had stopped crying, but his hands shook as he reached for Eleanor's wedding ring. May I? He asked quietly. Sheriff Crawley nodded. Of course, Mr. Davis. The ring slipped onto James's pinky finger, the only finger small enough to hold it. He closed his eyes and for a moment, 35 years melted away. He was young again, slipping that same ring onto Eleanor's finger in the small Baptist church where they promised to love each other forever. Sarah continued reading, her teacher's voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was discovering. October 10th, 1979. I can't stay silent anymore. What I witnessed today in Mr. Holloway's office will haunt me forever. Those children, sweet Lord, those innocent children. Holloway, Sheriff Crawley said sharply. Richard Holloway was the school board president back then. My father mentioned him in the old case files. Sarah turned the page, revealing more of Eleanor's careful script. Tommy Washington came to me after school today, crying. He's only 8 years old, but the things he told me. I had to document everything. The bruises on his arms weren't from playing. They were fingerprints. The room fell silent again. Everyone understood the implications, but Sarah continued reading Eleanor's words. I've spoken to 3 other children now. Maria Santos, little Billy Henderson, and Sarah Campbell, my sweet Sarah who's finally learning to read. They're all telling the same story. Mr. Holloway calls them to his office during recess, tells them he's checking on their progress. But what he's really doing? Sarah's voice broke. She looked up at the others, her face pale. She was protecting me. Even then, she was trying to protect us. James reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. Keep reading, child. Eleanor would want her story told. With renewed strength, Sarah continued. I've been documenting everything for weeks now. Times, dates, what the children told me. I have photographs of the bruises, Polaroids I took with the school camera when I kept the children after school to help with their reading. I told them we were playing a game, that the pictures would help me remember how brave they were. Sheriff Crawley was taking notes furiously. This is a detailed record of abuse. Why didn't she report it immediately? Sarah found the answer on the next page. I tried to tell Principal Morrison, but he cut me off. Said Mr. Holloway was a pillar of the community and that I should be careful about making accusations I couldn't prove. But I can prove it. I have everything documented. The school board meeting is scheduled for October 22nd. I'm going to present everything, the photos, the testimonies, all of it. October 22nd, 1979, James said quietly. She disappeared on October 21st. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Eleanor had been scheduled to expose Richard Holloway's abuse of children, and she had vanished the day before the meeting. Sarah turned to the final journal page, dated October 20th, 1979, just one day before Eleanor disappeared. I'm scared, but I can't back down now. James doesn't know the full truth. I've been protecting him too. If something happens to me, I've hidden copies of everything. The photos are with Mrs. Henderson at the school. She doesn't know what they are, just that I asked her to keep them safe. The full documentation is in my metal box, buried where only someone who truly cares about children would think to look. If I don't make it to Monday's meeting, someone else will have to speak for these babies. Mr. Holloway can't be allowed to hurt any more children. The final lines sent chills through everyone in the room. Richard Holloway sees me watching him now. Yesterday, he cornered me after school and told me that troublesome teachers sometimes find new jobs in other towns. But I won't run. These children need someone to fight for them. Sheriff Crawley set down her pen and looked directly at James. Mr. Davis, did Eleanor ever mention Richard Holloway to you? James was quiet for a long moment, his mind reaching back through decades of grief. She mentioned him once. Said he gave her the creeps, the way he looked at the children. But she never told me. His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. She was protecting me. If I'd known what he was doing, I would have confronted him myself. And probably ended up finished beside her. Sheriff Crawley said grimly. Sarah was studying the journal pages more carefully. There's something else here. She mentions Mrs. Henderson keeping photographs safe. Mrs. Henderson, she was the school secretary. She might still be alive. Sheriff Crawley was already reaching for her phone. Deputy Martinez, I need you to track down a woman named Henderson who worked at Pine Grove Elementary in 1979. And I want everything we can find on Richard Holloway, where he went after he left Millbrook, whether he's still alive, everything. As the deputy hurried out to begin his research, James Davis spoke quietly. What happened to him? To Holloway? Sheriff Crawley flipped through her father's old case files. According to these notes, Richard Holloway retired from the school board on October 23, 1979, 2 days after Eleanor disappeared. He moved to Florida that same week, citing health concerns. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Holloway had eliminated his accuser and immediately fled town, leaving behind a trail of traumatized children and a grieving husband who would spend the rest of his life wondering what had happened to his wife. Sarah carefully gathered the journal pages, her hands trembling with anger and determination. "We have to tell their story. Eleanor's story and the children's stories. All of us. We will," Sheriff Crawley promised. "But first, we need to find out if Richard Holloway is still alive. Because if he is, he's going to finally face justice for what he did to Eleanor Davis and those children." Outside the sheriff's station, the sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town that had kept Eleanor's secret buried for 35 years. But secrets, like truth, have a way of rising to the surface when the time is right. Eleanor Davis was finally going to have her day in court, even if she couldn't be there to see it. 3 weeks after the discovery of Eleanor's journal, the story broke like a dam bursting after decades of pressure. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran the headline on their front page: "Teacher's 35-year-old crime linked to child abuse cover-up." Within hours, news vans lined the streets of Millbrook, and reporters knocked on doors throughout the quiet Georgia town. Sarah Campbell found herself at the center of a media storm she never could have imagined. Her simple desire to plant a memorial tree had uncovered one of the most disturbing cases of institutional corruption in the state's recent history. But she wasn't backing down. Eleanor Davis had taught her to be brave, and now it was time to prove she'd learned the lesson. "We're reopening the Eleanor Davis case as a homicide investigation," Sheriff Crawley announced at a packed press conference. "We're also launching a comprehensive investigation into allegations of child abuse that may have been covered up by school officials in 1979. The announcement sent shockwaves through Millbrook's older residents, many of whom remembered Richard Holloway as a respected community leader. But others, particularly those who had been children in 1979, began coming forward with memories they had buried for decades. Marcus Thompson, the accountant who had attended the tree planting ceremony, was the first. He called Sheriff Crawley's office the day after the press conference, his voice shaking as he spoke. "I was one of the children Mrs. Davis was trying to protect," he said. "I never told anyone what Mr. Holloway did to me. I was 8 years old, and I thought it was my fault." Within a week, 6 more adults had come forward, all with similar stories. The pattern was always the same. Holloway would call children to his office during recess, ostensibly to discuss their academic progress. Behind closed doors, he would abuse them while telling them that no one would believe them if they told. "He said I was special," whispered Maria Santos, now Maria Santos Williams, a mother of 3. "He said the things he did were our secret, and that if I told anyone, I would get in trouble, not him." The legal wheels began turning slowly but inevitably. The district attorney, Jennifer Walsh, announced that despite the passage of time, the state would pursue all available legal remedies. But there was a problem. Richard Holloway had died in 2003, taking his secrets with him to the grave. "We can't prosecute a deceased man," DA Walsh explained to the growing crowd of reporters. "But we can seek justice for the victims and accountability from any institutions that may have facilitated or covered up these crimes." That's when James Davis made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. With Sarah Campbell by his side, he filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Millbrook School District, alleging that they had knowledge of Holloway's crimes and had silenced Eleanor to protect him. "I don't care about money," James told the packed courthouse steps, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I care about my wife's reputation. For 35 years, people whispered that maybe Eleanor ran away, maybe she abandoned me. Now everyone will know the truth, she died trying to protect children." The school district's lawyers immediately claimed that any evidence of wrongdoing had been destroyed in routine document purging, and that no current employees had knowledge of events from 1979. But Sarah Campbell wasn't giving up that easily. "There has to be more evidence," she told Sheriff Crawley during one of their regular meetings. "Eleanor mentioned Mrs. Henderson, the school's secretary. Have we found her yet?" Deputy Martinez had been searching for weeks. "Margaret Henderson moved to Savannah in 1985. She's 87 now, lives in a nursing home. But here's the interesting part. When I called to ask about interviewing her, she said she'd been waiting 35 years for someone to ask her about Eleanor Davis." The trip to Savannah took place on a rainy Thursday morning. Sarah, James, and Sheriff Crawley sat in the small, sunny room of Magnolia Manor nursing home, facing a tiny woman with sharp blue eyes and hands that trembled with age but not uncertainty. "I knew this day would come," Margaret Henderson said, her voice still carrying traces of her Georgia accent. "I've been carrying Eleanor's secret for 35 years, and it's been eating me alive." She reached into the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "Eleanor gave me this the Friday before she disappeared. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to the police. But when she vanished, I got scared. Mr. Holloway came to see me the day after she disappeared. He told me that if I had anything that belonged to Eleanor, I should destroy it for everyone's protection." Margaret's hands shook as she handed over the envelope. "I couldn't destroy it. Those poor children. I knew what he was doing. We all knew, but nobody wanted to believe it. He was too powerful, too connected." Inside the envelope were Polaroid photographs that made everyone in the room gasp in horror. Pictures of bruises, of children's faces streaked with tears, of small bodies marked by adult hands. Each photo was carefully labeled in Eleanor's handwriting with dates, times, and the child's initials. But the most damning piece of evidence was at the bottom of the envelope, a typed memo addressed to the Georgia State Department of Education, dated October 19, 1979. It was a formal complaint detailing Holloway's abuse, complete with witness statements and photographic evidence. Eleanor had carbon copied the memo, intending to send copies to multiple state agencies. Her signature was at the bottom, along with a note. "Additional copies hidden in secure location." She was going to expose everything, Sheriff Crawley said quietly. The school board meeting was just the beginning. She was taking this all the way to the state level. Margaret Henderson nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That's why they finished her. Richard Holloway couldn't let her destroy his life, so he destroyed hers instead." The evidence was overwhelming now. Eleanor Davis hadn't just stumbled upon isolated incidents of abuse. She had uncovered a systematic pattern of criminal behavior, and had compiled evidence that would have destroyed Holloway and exposed the complicity of anyone who had helped cover it up. As they drove back to Millbrook that evening, James Davis stared out the car window at the passing Georgia landscape. For 35 years, he had wondered if Eleanor had left him voluntarily. Now he knew the truth. She had died because she loved children too much to let them suffer in silence. "She was so brave," he whispered. "My Eleanor was so very brave." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "She still is, Mr. Davis. Her courage is finally going to protect those children, even after all these years." The cover-up that had lasted 35 years was finally cracking, and the truth was spilling out like sunlight after a long, dark night. 1 year after the discovery of Eleanor's journal, Millbrook's town square buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in decades. A stage had been erected in front of the old courthouse, draped in purple and gold, Eleanor's favorite colors, according to James. Hundreds of people had gathered for what the town council was calling a reconciliation ceremony. But everyone knew it was really Eleanor Davis's funeral, 36 years overdue. The legal battles had concluded 3 months earlier with a landmark settlement. The Millbrook School District agreed to pay damages to the 7 survivors who had come forward, along with establishing the Eleanor Davis Foundation for Child Protection. More importantly, they publicly acknowledged their role in covering up Holloway's crimes and Eleanor's passing. "Today, we right a terrible wrong," announced Mayor Patricia Collins from the podium. "Today, we finally listened to Eleanor Davis's voice." Sarah Campbell, now the Foundation's director, approached the microphone with Eleanor's original journal pages carefully preserved in a display case. The crowd fell silent as she began to read the words that had been buried for so long. October 20th, 1979. "I'm scared, but I can't back down now. These children need someone to fight for them." Among the audience, gray-haired adults who had been children in 1979 wept openly. Marcus Thompson held his 8-year-old son's hand tightly, finally understanding that the nightmares that had haunted him for decades weren't his fault. Maria Santos Williams stood with her 3 daughters, showing them what courage looked like when it demanded justice. James Davis, now 75 and frail but determined, slowly made his way to the podium. The crowd rose in spontaneous applause as he reached into his pocket and pulled out Eleanor's wedding ring, the same ring that had been buried with her secrets for 35 years. "My wife Eleanor was just 28 when she died," he began, his voice carrying across the silent square. "She could have lived for 50 more years, could have taught thousands more children, could have been a grandmother to babies we never had the chance to make." His voice broke, but he continued. "But Eleanor didn't die for nothing. She died because she believed that protecting children was worth any risk. And today, finally, her voice is being heard." The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Sheriff Crawley announced that the state had officially posthumously honored Eleanor with the Georgia Educator's Medal of Courage, the highest honor the state could bestow on a teacher. "Eleanor Davis represents the best of what educators can be," said State Superintendent Rebecca Martinez, who had driven down from Atlanta specifically for the ceremony. "She saw injustice and refused to look away, even when it cost her everything." But the day's biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Dr. William Henderson, Margaret Henderson's grandson, approached the microphone with a weathered cardboard box in his hands. "My grandmother passed away last month," he announced. "But before she died, she asked me to bring this to today's ceremony." Inside the box were dozens of letters, correspondence between Margaret Henderson and various state officials dating from 1980 to 2010. For 30 years after Eleanor's death, Margaret had been quietly sending copies of Eleanor's evidence to anyone who would listen, demanding justice for her deceased friend. "My grandmother never stopped fighting for Mrs. Davis," Dr. Henderson explained. "Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, Grandma would send these letters to the state education department, anyone she thought might care. Most never responded, but she never gave up." The final letter, dated just 6 months before Margaret's death, was addressed to Sarah Campbell. "Dear Miss Campbell, I've been watching the news about Eleanor's case. I'm so proud of what you're doing. Eleanor would be proud too. Please don't let them bury her story again. Some truths are too important to stay buried. Margaret Henderson." As the ceremony concluded, people began moving toward the town's newest landmark, the Eleanor Davis Memorial Library, built on the exact spot where Pine Grove Elementary had once stood. The library's children's section featured a reading nook with a bronze plaque that read, "Every child deserves to be heard, protected, and believed." James Davis cut the ribbon with shaking hands, and as the doors opened, children rushed inside with the same enthusiasm Eleanor's students had once shown for her classroom. The first book checked out was Charlotte's Web, the same story Eleanor had been reading to her class the week she disappeared. Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and the town grew quiet, Sarah Campbell stood alone in the Memorial Library's main hall. Above the circulation desk hung a portrait of Eleanor Davis, young, smiling, with eyes full of the hope and determination that had ultimately cost her life, but had finally brought justice to those she died protecting. Sarah opened Eleanor's journal to the final page and read aloud the words that had become the Foundation's motto. "Truth may sleep, but it cannot die." Outside, the memorial oak tree that had started it all swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches reaching toward a sky finally clear of the secrets that had shadowed Millbrook for 36 years. Eleanor Davis was home at last, and her voice, silenced by hatred but preserved by love, would continue speaking for children who needed someone to believe in them, protect them, and fight for them. In death, as in life, Eleanor Davis was still teaching the most important lesson of all, that some things are worth any sacrifice, and truth, no matter how long buried, will always find a way to rise again.